I'm Eric Richard Hansen. Today's date is February 13th, and I am 75 years old.
Wow. Okay. And did you receive the release form? And is it okay with you if we record this and post it?
Yes, it is.
Great. Um, so why don't we start out by you just talking a little bit about your background, like where you grew up, your family,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah, and there's some very powerful storylines in the family, and I'll try to just capture them shortly to illustrate what an influence they were on me, without going down some of the rabbit holes that are very appealing, but which we could spend the whole hour on that alone. I was born October 3rd, 1948, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, New York City. We lived on the fifth floor of a five-floor walk-up. When I was five, we moved to the South Bronx, to the projects. We lived on the 14th floor of the projects. When I was eight, we moved to East Orange, New Jersey, which is directly next to, adjacent to Newark, a city suburb. We moved into an apartment there. Memory has us, I think, on the third floor there. Um, my family, there's some huge influences there. Uh, is full of war resistors and civil rights activists. My parents, my father was a conscientious objector in World War II. He did alternative service. My mother's sister, Marge, married a guy by the name of Bob Swan, who was a refusenik in World War II and refused to do alternate service as a conscientious objector. And during that time, he and Bayard Rustin um, led a movement from inside the federal prison system to desegregate the federal prison system, and they won. Um, Bob was a very well-known activist. Stephanie Mills wrote his biography named On Gandhi's Path. Marge also, they were both in the front lines their whole lives. Prison sentences, arrests. Marge was good friends with Coretta Scott and knew Coretta long before she met Martin. And I offer those as just as illustrations of what powerful storylines they were. And storylines that have pretty much haunted me my whole life. Just that, oh, by the way, you should do more. You should try to address these problems. Um, Marge and Bob are. My parents were unusual and principled. They weren't on the front lines of the demonstrations or doing prison sentences or the rest that Marge and Bob were encountering. And also their farmhouse in Connecticut, which was a center of nonviolent activity against the subs being launched at Groton, the nuclear subs, was shot up by a right-wing militia. I think there were 60 shots fired. And just as an illustration of how intense things were around the corner, so to speak, in my family and what I was exposed to. In East Orange, New Jersey, I became active in a YMCA teenage program. That program was largely African American. The neighborhood we moved into was, quote, transitioning, becoming very predominantly African American. So I grew up in that kind of a scene. The Y secretary from that teenage program took us to Atlantic City in 1964, where Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democrats were trying to be seated as delegates at the Democratic National Convention. So we were demonstrating out on the boardwalk there in Atlantic City, and that's probably my first ever demonstration. And in reality, it was a Black Lives Matter demonstration in 1964. I was probably 16. And graduated from high school, didn't know what I wanted to do, worked for Prudential Insurance as a clerk for 6 months. And then the secretary of the Y program said, why don't you go to school? And lo and behold, there was George Williams College in suburban Chicago in Downers Grove. It had shortly before moved out from Hyde Park. And that was a college that was kind of a farm club system for the YMCA and the boys clubs. There were 40 of us out there from New Jersey, overwhelmingly African American bunch. And the local suburban police really did not welcome the people of color riding around in their suburb at all. And we were pretty much getting stopped every weekend, just driving here or driving there by the police, pulled over, asked what we were up to, and other things like that. So anyway, I went to school for 6 months there. I was just kind of in idle in my life, and a friend had gone to school in Denmark at an international, like junior college, and said, why don't you go there? I ended up going there. I ended up in Denmark and Europe for a year. I met a woman there who later became my wife in Chicago, whom I think you know quite well, Jetta Thomasen. And spent a year in Europe, about half of that at the college, half of that at working in the port as a longshoreman, working at various volunteer work camps, and learning about myself that I didn't want to be an expatriate in Copenhagen or Stockholm, that I might be angry with the system, but I was an American and I was ready to go home. I had also gotten a glimpse of East Berlin on a school trip that we took to Prague, in which the train went through East Germany and East Berlin. We had to change trains. And that was pretty enlightening about what that was all about. Also had teachers who, had like from England, and they had socialist friends and networks back in the 1920s. And they would look at me and go, Eric, a lot of my friends went to Russia and they all disappeared. So there was also, besides many, many other themes going on, there was a very rich dose of this is the Iron Curtain and this is not a solution here at all. Came back, I was living in Austin. I remember working day labor. And in Austin, a neighborhood in the west side of Chicago, working day labor meant that there was quite a few African Americans. You were going in the morning, you would shape up and they would call you out and say, I got this job, I got that job. And I got a very distinct memory of the morning that Fred Hampton was murdered by the Chicago police, and just the buzz in the room that morning. I can't remember exactly where I ran into rising up angry people. I was searching for the path forward like everybody else I knew. And somewhere along the line, I ran into somebody peddling papers, or I saw the paper somewhere and became involved. And you want me to stop there and we'll start talking about exactly where?
Yeah. When you got it, how did you get involved? Like, what were the steps to getting involved in Rising Up Angry, and what did you do?
I'm not sure if I remember conscious steps. I remember different people. There was a number of different programs that I was working on, but probably the primary one was the legal program. And I've got a memory of me as the coordinator or managing editor, perhaps you would call it, of the program. And that program was very exciting. And I remember we'd be going to luncheons of the National Lawyers Guild, and there was a bunch of lawyers that were backing us up, and they would take cases on all kinds of cases, housing, petty crime, and they would take them on either at cost or free. because they were sympathetic with the organization that we were trying to build, and the organization had a model to was largely influenced by the Black Panthers and the whole serve the people thing. There was the Fritzie Engelstein Health Clinic that I wasn't directly involved with, but certainly I knew a lot of people that worked there. There was the legal program. There was, selling the newspaper. I remember on Saturdays we'd go to Lincoln and Belmont and Ashland. That was a very busy pedestrian corner, and other places, and just engage people and sell the Rising Up Angry newspaper. Eventually, there was also a Sports for the People program. I think Mike Oken and others were very influential in starting that. And I remember the volleyball games and just the good vibe of people working hard, but not cutthroat competition. And very importantly, values, while we were playing volleyball, that you were trying to build friendship, that it was not a scene where you were trying to put down the other side. And also Great Lakes, Naval Base, the military thing. We had a fair amount of people, mostly guys, coming out of the military, coming back from Vietnam, not feeling inspired by what they had seen, and actually feeling very strongly questioning of why the whole war was going on at all. And some of them coming back, with physical as well as psychic wounds. And there was an effort by us just to hang out on the Navy base, which was kind of an hour north of Maine, downtown Chicago. Talk to guys, try to help them get out if they were so inclined. And I'm trying to think if I'm missing any other big program. The dances were another big part. I mean, maybe it's just time. My memory is we had close to 1,000 or so people at some of those events. And that was just big fun to organize this huge party. And most of all, I think that I had a feeling like the group, the vision was in touch with regular people. I don't know if you want to say working class or just blue collar Chicago, not necessarily the University of Chicago crowd, for example, or the Madison UW University of Wisconsin. In other words, people had some part of their lives in which they felt comfortable in that environment. And also a vision that this was very much what needed to be done, was to build up in the working class white communities the same consciousness that we saw in the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. I think the Young Patriots in Uptown were influenced because several of the primary people had been involved there in Uptown with Join, I believe. So there was a certain appeal. There was a certain spirit that went with Rising Up Angry. And the times were just intense. Things were happening, the war, there was all these assassinations. In Chicago, there was the murder of Fred Hampton. And there was a lot of tension with the police, is my memory, And that just never really went away. It was always looming there, and then sometimes it would get more intense than others.
Talk a little bit more about the legal program that you were involved in. Like, if someone didn't know what it was, how would you explain what it was?
It was a voluntarily staffed, community-based, in which we would have clinic, which I think was at the Rising Up Angry office. And we would have posted hours, and we would just, in the newspaper as well as other ways, that we would spread the word that we were there to help. And people would come in with their different legal issues. And some of them were minor criminal ones. Some of them were housing and different things like that. And we had a bunch of lawyers that liked us and liked what we were trying to do with our lives, what we were trying to do for the community, what we were trying to do to build the organization. Mark Kadish's name, I mean, certainly looms large. Many others. And I was working there. I'm pretty sure I remember Gary Anderson working there. Bill Bonner was the head, I believe, and maybe I was his deputy. That might be, I was more of an administrative leader, is my memory. And so with that, we were building up a lot of credibility with people as far as we were actually doing something. We weren't just talking about it. We were actually coming up with things to address people's lives and the everyday problems they were having, whether it was with the police, with the landlord, or something else.
And as you look back now on what happened to you in Rising Up Angry and your work in the program, was there anything about the process or your experiences that stick out, that jump out?
Mostly just this feeling that a new world was possible, that we were going to plug away at this. But the other thing was just an influence of values and liking to dance. I mean, I just remember a lot of dancing to Motown. I remember Curtis Mayfield. And growing up where I grew up, um, Motown was my church hymn. It's like if you were not feeling that well, you would turn on some Motown. Even today, if I'm not in the best of moods, I go on YouTube and I punch up Curtis Mayfield, I punch up The Temptations, and I find these songs that just lift me. It's like, and you think that way, and you could just hear somebody say, "Oh, happy day." And growing up with so many African Americans that I did, that was very direct experience. It was not abstract at all. It's like, okay, it's Saturday night and we're going to dance and sing. And I don't have the best singing voice, but it doesn't matter. We're going to lift our own spirits. We're going to move. We're going to take a couple hours and we're going to be happy before we got to go back out there and deal with whatever it is that we have to deal with. So it's not that I'm trying to describe Rising Up Angry as a church, because it wasn't, but there was this feeling of, okay, this is a whole thing. This is our whole lives, and we have to deal with this. And also just that, we might not be in prison or in lockup at the moment, but others we knew were in the service. And that's part of us going up the Great Lakes. And it was this feeling of we're not going to leave somebody behind, that we're going to do what we can to bring people along, including ourselves, to survive this period where, the powers that be weren't exactly encouraging or benevolent, or perhaps we had tried that path a little bit and we were pretty darn sure that it was not a healthy path to be on.
So since Rising Up Angry, what have you been doing?
That is a long story, a lot.
Well,
Let me chronologically,
a short version of the long story.
a short version of the long story. As Rising Up Angry, as it faded in the mid 70s, I eventually became a tool and die apprentice and then a journeyman tool and die maker. And did that off and on for many years. And interestingly, because of the way the economy was, I could from time to time to get a couple weeks off and go off to the mountains and go hiking and backpacking. The other part of my personal life is that even though I grew up in an apartment, even in East Orange, New Jersey, eventually my parents obtained a very cheap cabin up in the New Jersey hills, which allowed me to run around the woods, play in a creek. And eventually that was like, of course, that was a healing place. That was a fun experience. So as an adult, I backpacking was growing at that time, and here I am working in machine shops, sometimes in larger factories, but a lot of times in small tool and die shops, and the owner's over there, and he thinks 60 hours a week builds character, and you're like, my gosh, let me out of this room, I want to see the sun. I would regularly go to the West, often on a train, and do a backpacking trip. The one um, often to Glacier National Park, later the Beartooth, later a couple of month-long trips in the Sierras in California. And interestingly, the Grand Canyon, and that started with a reunion really of people from Chicago, from Albuquerque and the Bay Area. And Thanksgiving week, we would meet and go backpacking in the Grand Canyon. And that fell apart for a couple of years, and then I started up again on my own or with new friends. And I think I've done 47 trips there. And knock on wood, next Tuesday I'll be getting on the train here and going through Chicago and going to Flagstaff and hiking into the canyon. Um,
Great. And so, yeah, go ahead.
Politically, I'm sorry, go ahead, Bob.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Keep going.
Yeah, politically, off and on, I've been involved with a lot of the campaigns and here, and also kind of finding my feet in water protector campaigns, which combined with my hiking background. Eventually, I started writing. I ran into one of the editors from Backpacker magazine, and lo and behold, they took me under their wing and kind of whipped me into shape. I was the sports editor of my high school newspaper, but I wasn't that good. The editors at Backpacker made me good and made me learn how to write short and well and get to the point very quickly. That led to writing a hiking guidebook for Wisconsin. And that was like 2 long summers of field work, living out of the back of a station wagon or in a tent. You would have to be akin to a Buddhist monk to think it was all meaningful, but it was very meaningful to me. The life might have been humble, but I spent a lot of time in beautiful places. And then that eventually led to writing a hiking guidebook for Michigan's Upper Peninsula, because I was up there on assignment from the magazine and I saw something that just stunned me. There was a ridge called the Trap Hills that had never really been written about except for in an obscure North Country Trail newsletter. And so I did a book for up there. Combined, I walked 1,700 miles researching the books. Started doing slideshow because there was a mine threat in the UP, and drawing huge standing room crowds, 300 twice in Madison at Canoecopia and a paddling expo. But also, I mean, in places like Detroit, standing room only, with the local Sierra Club, with themes of hike the UP, save the UP. Now, politically, this gets very interesting because I was kind of running on this John Muir narrative at that point, thinking, oh, the West is the best, But as much as I hiked in the West, that narrative lost its sparkle. And this theory that the answers to life's great questions are in a landscape where nobody is just didn't stand up in the light of day, even though I pursued it. And I just came to see the West as interesting recreationally. But while I was working on the UP and Wisconsin books, I met people, not native, but very well-established allies of the tribes here, who were enlightening me about some huge narratives about the anti-mine campaigns here, the Protect the Clean Water. And the Ojibwe were brilliant when they signed their treaties, mostly Chief Buffalo, because what he did is he included in there, yes, we'll go over to that reservation, but all this, we retain rights to hunt, to fish, and to gather. And to gather was wild rice. And wild rice is not only food to the Ojibwe, it's holy. It's very important to their way of life. And wild rice needs quite pure water. These storylines fascinated me, you know, and I began writing op-eds. And the first one I wrote was about a mine threat in the UP. And I probably rewrote it for 3 months, took it into my writers group, and got a lot of help on it. And eventually it hit send and ended up running in the Chicago Tribune, and it ended up winning a couple of national awards, including Best Newspaper Commentary, Conservation, and Environmental Writing of the Year from the Outdoor Writers Association of America. So that meant that the writing was starting to shift. But it was also, I was doing all these slideshows, and the slideshows were pretty much like, I've got a waterfall for you. And oh, by the way, here's another waterfall. Does anybody else want a waterfall that they can have all to themselves? And having these slides of these incredible waterfalls, it was kind of like being Santa Claus. And starting to perceive that I could move the public on these things, and that there was this vast appetite for what I call our region's spiritual homeland in the north, up by Lake Superior. And that I had a role to play. And the books, humble as they might be, provided this whole media platform. I started doing statewide public radio. I did some commentaries on Milwaukee Public Radio. And one of them, which was titled Climate Change and Common Sense Conservation in Wisconsin at the time of the Copenhagen Climate Conference, went on to a first place from the Wisconsin Broadcasters Association. So my perception of one, what was important was changing. And two, I felt this regional sense of connecting people with the North. And I think the magnetic field of the UP runs in an arc in northern Wisconsin from Minneapolis all the way to Cleveland, perhaps. And that people just realize there's a lot of elbow room up there. There's a lot of waterfalls. There's a lot of shorelines to walk. And I've been on that path pretty much off and on since, with periods of activity and then eventually going, wait a minute, I'm tired of this. I can't go to another meeting. I got to go for a walk. I got to go for a hike. Let me pause.
Great.
Where do you want to go with this, Bob?
No, what I'm wondering is, it's, going to the environmentalism from Rising Up Angry, are there any lessons or anything that you got from Angry that helps you with the environmentalism and the path that you chose afterwards? Just connecting back.
The respect for regular people. And, I'm trying to figure out how to frame this, but the great value. And in Wisconsin, the epic, almost incredible campaign was Crandon. It went on for 27 years. And I can only describe it as a mass outbreak of spirituality by the citizens and the tribes of Wisconsin, staring down Exxon and winning. Winning by a landslide in the state legislature, forcing a Republican governor to sign a mining bill on the banks of the Wolf River on Earth Day. And the fine print of that bill said, you must prove that it's safe first. We're not going to chase you after you polluted this river that means so much to all of us. You are going to have to prove that such a mine and such a wet environment has been opened before and closed safely. So there was all that movement, and I got to emphasize, I was not directly involved at that time in the 90s, but I was mentored by various people that were just very highly visible and credible allies of the tribes as to how it happened and what the sociology was. It was grassroots, multiracial, strong tribal leadership, and it won big, very, very big. And that model to organize against corporate criminals, still shines and sparkles, and you're just kind of guided by that. But I think from Rising Up Angry, it was the you were your thoughts were fortified that it's with the regular people that you build power, and that it was very important not to be disrespectful, but not to accept the elitism that might be coming from Madison, for example. That if somebody's a professor or a PhD, then they're worth listening to. Those thoughts, I'm sure directly came from Rising Up Angry at some point. And they're still present. And it's just basically this feeling of respect for regular people. If you're at a gas pump and there's somebody there and they've got a pickup truck, and I drove a pickup truck for many years, and it's amazing what a calling card that is with a lot of people. People just figure you got to be okay if you're driving one of those, and you're just like, how you doing? And you're pumping gas and you're talking about the weather or the ice fishing or whatever. Let me pause there. Where do you want to go with this, Bob?
Well, I just want that as you sort of look back and all your activism, throughout your life, if
Yeah.
there's like one lesson or one thing that you would like to share to younger activists now, whether they want to hear it from old people or not, but that you would like to share that you would think that as they
Who's the old people? Who are we referring to here?
Oh yeah, well, I'm referring to myself, but I'm saying if you had one thing that you wanted to share to young activists that are just getting ready to change the world, what would that be? Or you can maybe have two things.
I think the thing, and I get this from many experiences, and I'm sure it's partly from Rising Up Angry, but I can't put my finger on it. But, believe with every ounce of strength that you have that it's possible to change these things. Belief is a very powerful thing. And one of the things that I found most heartening about some of these campaigns here against the mines, against the crude oil pipelines in Enbridge, working with the tribes, and tribal culture. I'll tell you, you respect your elders, or else you're going to hear about it. And it's very touching when you run into that, because they don't make a big deal out of it. They just say, you're not going to stand in line and wait for food. They look at your hair and they say, you're an elder, come with me. And you're going to sit down. And it's not this big, huge fuss. It's just like, this is the way we do things, and we want you to respect that way. But belief in human beings, belief that there's all these histories. And partly this goes back to backpacker editors. There was a guy that really drilled me on destination. And he was like, why should I go there next weekend? And what I learned from him was every damn place has a storyline. And the storyline may be biology, it might be botany, it might be native history, it might be settler history, but there's a storyline there. And it's important for you to be listening to the stories. And during the Crandon campaign, there was an elder whom I'd never met from the Mole Lake Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. And Mole Lake, they were directly threatened by the mine proposal. And Fran Van Zyl said something hugely powerful. And what she said, and she was an elder from there, was, it's not about the mine, it's about the water. And I was just like, hallelujah. I mean, it's not about climate change. It's about the good life here and passing on a reasonable chance for a good life to generations still to come. But in the meantime, there are all these little opportunities to enjoy life, to sit by the water, to listen to the gurgling brook, to enjoy the sounds of the spring coming out of the ground, to go down to the lake shore and just look out in Chicago, or here I live in Milwaukee, at this pristine horizon off to our east, and just go, Yes. Okay. When we sit there for a while and then we get recharged or rejuvenated. How's that, Bob?
Great. That's great. I think that we can call it a quit unless you do have anything else to say that you want to.
No, just greetings to all my colleagues and friends I haven't seen in quite some time. We
Great.
had a very unfortunate highway construction during the Foxconn thing, which meant that we had very narrow lanes down by Racine and Kenosha. If I would have been driving in for some of the recent uh, reunions or memorial gatherings of RUA people. And unfortunately, on the evenings those were happening, it was like in the fall, dark was coming early, and it was raining. And I could not bring myself to drive through that construction zone where several people had died. And I'm looking forward to seeing everybody.
Great.
And sorry I've been away so long.